Hey, so today's tutorial is going to be a crash course into mastering, and hopefully in the next 15 minutes I'm going to give you a bit of a brief overview as to what mastering is, how to get it in your tracks, and to give you some real easy settings to get mastering on your music and to get your tracks sounding as polished and as ready as they possibly can do in a short amount of time. What I will say is, like anything that I explore in these little tutorials that I've been putting out on YouTube, is that any of these settings, the better you get at production, the better you get at making music and making tracks, you're going to want to be upskilling your knowledge and understanding some of the details of what these are. But in terms of today, this is about getting up and going, getting some mastering on your tracks, and getting you started on the road to getting your tracks properly polished and finished. So mastering, in a nutshell, is basically adding a last level of polish to your main mix. So you've got your track, you've mixed all your channels. We're going to be using one of my tracks here today just to show you a few principles, but you're really happy with your main mix here. And what mastering is it's tweaking the EQ just to balance out your mix. It's adding a little bit of compression and putting a limiter on there to make sure your track does not go above 0 dB and start clipping. Because if I press play here, an unmastered track, if you look at the peak level meter here, you're going to see what the first problem is when you start mastering and looking at your mixes. So hopefully you've noticed that my track is clipping. It's actually going into the red, which is bad and not something you want your tracks to be doing. There's two ways of fixing that. The first way would be the most intuitive way, and that you may have even done this yourself, which is to reach for your main output fader and to take it down, say, by a couple of dB in order to make sure it won't clip. But that does fix one problem in that it won't be going over anymore, but it presents a completely new problem. That new problem is that my track is a lot quieter than it was 10 seconds ago, which is not a good place that we want to be in if the whole point of this is to try and make our track sound loud and polished and as good as other people's are in the marketplace. So we want to put this back up to 0, our main fader, and we're going to be introducing a few effects that are going to help us balance out this mix. So if you're following along with one of your tracks in the background, I want you to put these effects on in this order. I cannot stress that enough, that if you get the order wrong, it's not going to be effective and it's not going to sound as good as it possibly can do. So in this order, first you want to put a gain, which is under utility at the bottom here. Secondly, you want to put on channel EQ, which is under EQ, channel EQ there. Thirdly, you want to be putting on something called a MultiPresser. It's under dynamics and it's down the bottom here, MultiPresser. And lastly, you're going to be putting on a limiter, and we're going to be using this adaptive limiter here at the top. So we've got our effects on there in this specific order, and even if I don't touch any of these presets here, it's going to have fixed one of our problems. If I set this at 0 dB where it was at the start and press play, you'll notice our track is no longer going into the red. So even before I've even got into any of the settings, we're already better than we were when we started off. I'm going to go through these different effects here. I'm going to show you what the settings are and why they're useful, but we're going to miss the first one, gain, and we're going to come back to that right at the very end. So we're going to start off with the second one in our little chain, channel EQ. And the EQs in Logic are really great for a few reasons, but one of the main reasons I like them is because it comes with this analyzer, and what it does is it here's your frequency range from 20 Hertz right up to 20,000 Hertz. and it shows you all the frequencies in your entire mix, and it shows you which ones are louder than others, and it shows you how balanced your track is looking. If I press play, you can see it in visual format here. Now, this is quite a nice balanced mix because I spent a long time making sure that my mix was sounding as good as possibly can be. But what you can do is you can have a look on here and you can see if there's any frequencies you may have missed. You know, when you're mixing it, you're using your ears. Maybe there's a huge spike in your bass frequency, say about 100 hertz. And you could look on here and think, oh, actually, that's something I need to fix. And there are two ways of fixing it. Number one is you can actually fix it in your channel EQ here. So you might want to just tweak whatever frequency it is that you've got a problem with. You might just want to tweak it down by a few dB. Or the other way of doing it, which is what is good about putting your mastering on your main mix, is that you might want to find the instrument that is causing that problem. So I've got three basses all layered up on top of one another here. It may be, say I had like a huge spike in my bass frequencies, maybe it's because one of my basses is being too loud, it's not compressed enough, it's not EQ'd properly, or it's just too loud in the mix. So I might want to go and fix it at the source. But if you can't manage to do that, or it's easier, you can just do it in your EQ section on your mastering. A lot of the times I'll barely touch this at all. And if you do, it should be like little subtle boosts and cuts. You shouldn't have like a main mastering EQ that kind of looks like this, because it's going to sound a huge mess. So subtlety is the name of the game with your EQ. But a lot of times you might not even need that EQ if you've balanced your mix properly. Third in the line of effects here, and the second one that we're going to explain, is your multipressor. And what a multipressor is a compressor, or it's actually four compressors working all at the same time on different frequency ranges in your mix. So this number one compressor is working on our lows. The second one is working on our low mids. The third one on our high mids, and the fourth one on our highs. And this is very confusing, especially if the idea of one compressor you're struggling to get your head around. Maybe you don't quite understand what a threshold is, or ratio, or attack and release on compressors. So the idea of understanding four at the same time across your entire frequency range is going to be very confusing to you, which is why I would suggest the first time you start getting into this is to maybe look at some of these presets that come in Logic, because they're quite good to start off with. They're kind of split. You can usually guess what kind of ones they are. There's a rock one, a pop one, hip hop one, there's strings there, there's ones for boosting your bottom ends. The one we're going to start off with is the pop compressor, because it's a nice neutral place to start. But what I will say is use your ears so you can compare a few different types and choose which one sounds best to your own ears when you're mixing it. So we're going to choose this pop compressor, and when I press play, you'll notice on these little level meters here, on the left will be a bar that shows our input signal, and on the right will be a bar that shows our output signal. And you'll see that all of our four frequency bands are being treated differently by this multipressor. And when you're happy with the preset that you've chosen, you can just get rid of that multipressor and leave it doing its thing. Last in our little line of effects is a limiter. And this is the easiest one to explain today, because I'm actually not going to go into that much detail in it at all. We're actually going to leave all of these settings, apart from we're going to be looking at this middle one here. And it says out ceiling. And what that means is your output ceiling. And it is a level at which you're telling the limiter, no matter how loud my track gets, I don't want my main mix to go above this value. So at the moment it's set as 0 dB. Some people, to make sure absolutely their track is not going to go above 0 dB in clip, they might set it at minus 0.1, which is what we're going to do today. But the rest of this, you can just leave it as it is. Obviously, the better you get at mixing and mastering and producing, you're probably going to be wanting to look up little individual tutorials to explain some of this stuff. But for the meantime, don't worry about it. Set it like that and leave it doing its thing. And already our track is going to sound a lot better than it did at the start. If I press play now, the last thing that I'm going to be talking about is your gain effect that I've put on here. And it's related to the dynamic range of our track. And what I mean by dynamic range is how loud and how quiet our track is at different points. And if I press play now here, our level is going to be up here. And the amount of black that we're going to see here is going to show us how much dynamic range there is in our track. The less black that you see, the more loud and compressed your track is going to sound. The more black there is, the more subtlety there is going to be in your mix, but maybe it's not going to be quite as overall, feel quite as loud as it could do. If you've got your mix sounding very good, you might end up with a decent setting here. I'm going to press play and hopefully I'm going to have a decent level of dynamic range here. Now, if I use my ears right now and I think that my track is sounding too saturated and too loud, and there's no subtlety in there, what I might do is use this gain just to take it down by a couple of dB. So I'm going to press play in a minute and I'm going to turn this gain dial down. And as I do, you're going to see that there's going to be a little bit more dynamic range here. And you're going to want to use your ears to check that, to check whereabouts you want that to sit. The other thing as well is if your mix is a little bit too quiet, you might want to boost this up by a couple of dB just to make sure that the signal going into your multipresser and your limiter is as good as it possibly can be. If you're struggling in terms of how loud this should be, a really good way of making sure your mastering sounds good is to get up a track in a similar genre to the one you're writing, hopefully by somebody who's released it professionally. And what you can do is you can press play on that track and compare it to your track with the mastering on, and hopefully they should sound similar loudness and similar compression levels if you really want to check them side by side. So basically that's it. If you stick these on in that order, you're going to have a pretty basic mastering on your tracks, and they're going to sound better than they did, and it's a really nice place to start. The last thing I'm going to talk about is just bouncing down. When you're bouncing down, I really suggest you use the locators up the top. Use this little yellow looping section. So what you can do is you can actually, when you bounce down in Logic, it detects where the start and end of this yellow section is. So you can manually choose where that should start bouncing down from. And what a good thing to do is just to overlap the start of your track so it doesn't start exactly on bar 1. There's just a little bit of space there. And the other thing to do is to go right to the very end, and if there's any tracks that go right to the very end, especially if they've got any reverb or delay that continues after the very final beat, is to get your automation up and just to fade out those tracks right at the very end to make sure that by the time your track is bounced down right at the very end, it goes down to 0, because you don't want to finish your track in the middle of a cymbal hit or a synth fading out or a guitar chord ringing out, because it just sounds really amateurish and not very good. So when you've done all that, you literally click BNCE and you bounce your track down. It's as simple as that. Hopefully this has kind of filled in a few gaps in your knowledge, especially if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by the idea of mastering and you're really frustrated that your tracks do not sound as good as they possibly can do when you compare them to other people's. I'm going to be putting out regular tutorials on this channel, so if you want to subscribe and come back in the future, hopefully there's going to be some more things that are going to help you out with your production and music making in the future. But thanks for listening. See you later. Bye.